Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Vienna, Austria. Joining us, as always, is FP's economics columnist Adam Tooze in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So today, instead of our normal set of data points, we're going to be dedicating the episode to a continuation of an informal series that we started late last year on Heterodox Economists. Listeners seemed to like those, and so we thought we would continue the series irregularly, perhaps every few weeks. And first off, I wanted to start by addressing something that several listeners pointed out after one of our last Heterodox Economist episodes, and that is that the Polish economist that we dedicated one segment to, Kalecki, as I put it throughout the episode, it turns out I was mispronouncing his name. In fact, it should be Kalecki. That would be the proper Polish pronunciation. So apologies, I guess, to the late Kalecki and other Polish speakers out there. And that, I guess, brings us to our current economist, not a Pole, but an Austrian, Joseph Schumpeter. I suppose since he is Austrian, it would be Joseph Schumpeter or something like that. But for, the purposes of this episode, I'll refer to him as Schumpeter. He lived in the United States, produced most of his work in the US, so I think that's a fair pronunciation. But to remind listeners, this series was meant to address economists who sometimes don't get evoked in the day-to-day policy debates, but who do shed interesting light on our politics nevertheless from, one unique vantage or another. And yeah, Schumpeter certainly falls under that category. Adam, we've tended to start these conversations by addressing these economists' biographies, and Schumpeter certainly does have an interesting one. Adam, I'm curious if you could give a sketch of that biography and how that may have shaped his ideas.
Yeah, I'm more of a Schump than a Schump person when it comes to Schumpeter, because you can also struggle over the Peter pronunciation, because it would be Schumpeter. But I mean, he really is a man of his times, and it's hard really not to think of his entire oeuvre as associated with his life. He comes from late Austrian Empire, partly Czech family, though he wasn't keen to advertise that fact. He was a notable figure in turn of the century Vienna, boasting of his ambition to be the greatest horseman, the greatest lover, and the greatest economist of his generation, modestly admitting that he, with regard to equestrianism, he may have fallen short. Already before 1914, he was a star. He had a visiting gig at Columbia and here in New York. What made him significant already at the time was that in intellectual terms, he was on the interface between the new breed of formal economics. He was a great admirer of Walras, the pioneer of formalized general equilibrium theory, which is a kind of mathematical model of the economy as a network of massive, sprawling network of interconnected markets, trading at a single instant in time across all prices. Anyway, it's one of the great formalisms of the late 19th century, and Schumpeter liked that kind of thing. He was also fluent in monetary theory. This was the golden age of the quantity theory. People will know Irving Fisher in the American context. Milton Friedman is his 20th century heir. Schumpeter was into that kind of economic theory too, whilst at the same time, coming from the German sphere, he was also influenced by the German historical school, which insisted on history, social process, individual agency, institutions, and Schumpeter will go on to become, his most influential role was really as an interpreter of democracy, arguably, in the 20th century, rather than any of his formal economics. So you think of him, he's an Austrian economist, but the crucial thing to understand about Schumpeter is he doesn't go down the route of this other Austrian economist. And that has to do with his politics, it has to do with his engagement with World War I. He was an opponent of the war. He wasn't an enthusiast for the war at all. But he then becomes involved quite directly in politics after the war. He's an active exponent. He becomes a finance minister in the post-war Republic of Austria. And that makes him quite different from the people that we think of as belonging to the Austrian economic school, people like Hayek ultimately, who reacted to the fall of the Habsburg Empire by retreating towards, if you like, globalism. So the global economy, this is the neoliberal fix that Quinn Slobodian analyzes so brilliantly in his history of neoliberalism and its Austrian roots. So as the empire collapses and democracy, national democracy, comes to the fore, and with it the tendency to intervene in the economy, one route for Austrian conservatives is to retreat towards the globe and at the global level, if you like, restore the external constraints on political choice that empire might previously have provided by constraining, the national protectionisms of small countries. That isn't Schumpeter's route. Schumpeter is in the trenches of trying to figure out how to... He's no left-winger. He's profoundly skeptical about naive views of democracy, but he regards democracy as inevitable. And so the choice really is how to do it right. And in his thinking about finance after World War I, some of his most interesting essays, he really comes close to blending a macroeconomic Keynesian understanding of the financial problems, a little bit like Keynes's famous essay, How to Pay for the War, that comes out in 1940. Schumpeter anticipates, as it were, this problem by saying, how do we pay for a social democratic experiment? And there's a very interesting blending of sociology. He's trying to get out of academia at that point. He goes into business for a while. It's all a disaster. And then in the mid-20s, almost in despair, he returns to academic life. He gets a gig in Japan, which becomes a kind of almost second spiritual home for him. He then returns to the German-speaking world, not to Austria, but to the great University of Bonn, which is one of the real centers of modern economic and political thinking in the Weimar Republic of the 1920s. And from there, then he moves to the United States and takes a position at Harvard, where his world really, I think, kind of collapses around him. I mean, it's a progressive program, starting out as like this flamboyant figure within the Habsburg Vienna. By the time he arrives on the east coast of the US in the 1930s, much of the context which made sense of Schumpeter's life is really disintegrated. He clings to the university as far as one's able to establish. I mean, he was a passionate teacher, profoundly devoted to his students. Perhaps he saw in the elite class being educated at Harvard a replacement for the European aristocracy whose demise he mourned so much. It was at Harvard that he struggled to finish his two big books, the huge study on business cycles, and then his compendious history of economic thought that was edited posthumously by his third American wife, Elizabeth Schumpeter. And it's at Harvard in the 1940s that he writes his most successful book, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, which is a really gloomy kind of assessment of the future from the vantage point of the early 1940s. And comparable to, though in many ways fundamentally different and interestingly contrasting with Hayek's Road to Serfdom, which also appears in the late stages of World War II. So it's an extraordinary life. He dies early in 1950 in the home of his second home of his American wife. So this sort of shooting star of early 20th century Central European economics kind of has this weird trajectory that goes out. The light goes out in 1950, and his thought, returns in waves. But as we'll see, I think it's most profoundly influential, really, in theories of democracy.
Well, to focus first on some of his, strictly economic thought. I mean, one of his contributions that is repeatedly cited is the way he placed entrepreneurship and innovation at the center of the story of capitalist growth. And that got me wondering about how exactly we should understand that contribution in the context of his time. I mean, how did previous economists explain growth in, presumably, I guess, a more linear fashion or non-punctuated fashion, sort of not punctuated by these moments of innovation or entrepreneurship? I mean, absent Schumpeter's story, I mean, what was the engine of growth understood to be at all?
It's a great question. And to put this in deep historical perspective, the essential point is that, the phenomenon of economic growth, long-run economic growth, modern economic growth, it only appears in the middle of the 19th century. So a generation or two before Schumpeter comes on the scene. It's not a reality in the economic history of the world before the 19th century and what we sort of easily loosely call the Industrial Revolution, right? What you saw prior to that was phases of growth followed by decline, followed by the stagnation, the Chinese case being the most dramatic and the most widely noticed. And so economic theory tended to follow that path in that it was a story of the rise and decline of prosperity civilization. It was, in the European case, haunted by the memory of Rome. And in somebody like, Malthus, it was, in theological terms, a kind of a morality tale of, humans vain imagining that they could escape, the fate that was really, over the long run, a fate of misery and poverty. And there were a variety of mechanisms that would take you back there. And in the 19th century, the drama of the 19th century is that in the course of the 19th century, around the 1850s, you could say, people often describe the Great Exhibition in London of 1851 as the moment where this realization first dawned, which was that something was happening and it was changing the world. But one of the legacies, one of the deep, deep legacies of this history is that most economic theory actually kind of has a problem explaining growth. So even 100 years later, like the growth theory models that somebody like Solow becomes famous for, in post-World War II America, that is, those neoclassical growth models have the property that over time growth stops. They stabilize at an equilibrium. Could be high, could be low, but they stabilize. Growth doesn't persist in those models. So formally, economics carries within it sort of a trace of its earlier formation in a period of history in which growth was not normal. And there are various schools of thought now which would, of course, insist that, say, ecological constraints are going to be binding on us, and growth for us too will in the end prove to be a temporary phenomenon. But in the period of optimism starting in the 1850s, technology is really the answer to your question. That's what drives growth. Capital accumulation by itself won't work, because in the end it reaches diminishing returns, and so more and more capital generates less and less productivity increase. Marxian theory similarly has a declining rate of profit story, which in the end will cause accumulation to stop unless we have a revolution that changes the circumstances. But the technological stories of the mid-19th century come along to answer this question of where does growth come from. And what they do is to add a new dimension to thinking about business leadership, let's put it that way, because you'd always had a story of capitalist people with money going all the way back to 18th century theorizing about, and they were different from landed aristocracy or gentry that had land. And so the economics was in large part about the relationship between those two groups, in Ricardo, for instance, in the early 19th century. And then there was always an idea also of sort of managers, and those play a role in almost all theories. But what the 19th century needed, and Schumpeter more than anyone else really forces to the forefront, is the idea of the entrepreneur as an agent of technological evolution. And, I was saying earlier that Schumpeter is most influential for his theory of democracy. What he foregrounds already in the early 20th century is thinking about entrepreneurs as agents of not just individual innovations, but waves of innovation. And this, I think, is really an effect of history, in the sense that in the late 19th century, we saw what some people call, rightly or wrongly, the second industrial revolution. So this was technologies like steel as opposed to iron, electrical engineering, chemical engineering, in the end, the motor car. This wave of innovations that bundle together and generate a surge of technological change, but also investment. And so finance and technological change go hand in hand. And Schumpeter is really the economist who explains how, out of an equilibrium theory of interest rates and capital markets stabilizing, which would not really in the long run allow you to explain growth, you could instead get this extraordinary, historically significant combination of technology and capital, which at the crucial moment in huge surges drives economies from one level of prosperity to another. And in that respect, this is also where the legacy of his historical economic formation comes in. His understanding of this was abstract. He was somebody who was always interested in formal models, but also it was a historically discrete story. First, there were these innovations, and then there were those innovations, and so on and so forth. And they come in historically relevant bunchings of innovations. And that was his story, really, of economic growth and the role of entrepreneurship in it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I couldn't help remarking on is that in this story, there's a kind of normative privileging of entrepreneurs, as if they play a heroic role in this story and kind of precisely breaking up this equilibrium and producing further growth. And I'm curious how that thought extends to the business enterprises themselves that entrepreneurs produce. I mean, according to Schumpeter's thought, are, monopolies that are produced as a result of these innovations, are they a natural and good product of innovation and capitalism? Should we be in support of monopolies as a result?
Well, I mean, at one level, yes, that follows in the sense that the profits that will merit the levels of investment that will shove the economy forward in an innovation spurt are the result of temporary market advantage, right? So that's a logical train. But an established monopoly is a very different thing. And this is where we come to the gloomier element of Schumpeter's prognostication, which is that along with people like Max Weber, who was his close contemporary of Weber, had lived longer, the logic of the period is also diagnosed as one of bureaucratization. So theory, and Weber was well known as the one of the first sociologists of bureaucracy and of the bureaucratic apparatuses, and those for Weber were both state and private bureaucracies. And for Schumpeter too, the tendency to shape oligopoly, then tending towards monopoly, was in part problematic because what it did was, in the form of bureaucratization, to perpetuate itself. So it would be one thing if you had wave after wave after wave of technical innovation with innovators building temporary advantages, gaining profit, and then being broken open by competitors. And that's the really optimistic view of antitrust that we see become dominant in American law and economics thinking from the 70s onwards, that all positions of market dominance are contestable, and so how much actual dominance you have depends on the circumstances. Schumpeter had a gloomier developmental vision, which by the 1940s was predicting essentially that competitive capitalism with this dynamic of entrepreneur-led innovation would give way to bureaucratic capitalism, and bureaucratic capitalism would then become the breeding ground for a class, if you like, of intellectual grave diggers of free capitalism, which would be the professional technocratic class that grew up within bureaucracy and the universities that served it. So to that extent, it's not just monopoly, it's the entire apparatus of societal control and discipline and so on that grows with it that dominates Schumpeter's historical thinking.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about Joseph Schumpeter. So if we were to shift to how this influences his political thinking, you mentioned yourself that he makes an argument in later work of his that democracy could essentially be doomed, according to his sort of economic and sociological analysis. Could you unpack that argument for us, and how do you assess it? I mean, do you see any evidence that he was right in that assessment?
Well, the interesting thing about Schumpeter is that he may be a conservative, but he's a intellectually good faith conservative. So he spends a lot of time in his intellectual life in a struggle with Marxism, and not a dumb version of Marxism either, but a rather sophisticated understanding of Marxian political economy. And if one was to say that Schumpeter thought the democracy was doomed, it would make sense if what we meant by that was that he thought that the underlying complexity and conflicts of modern class society meant that any naive view of democracy as this sort of, the representation of the popular and the general will by means of democratic mechanisms, that was doomed. Yes, indeed, Schumpeter did think that. And he thought that the starting point for any reasonably realistic or coherent account of modern politics was class and class divisions, and the impossibility, therefore, of constituting the general will in any simple sense, and therefore the obsolescence and increasing the ideological function of accounts of democracy that relied on the possibility of that collective will formation. But nevertheless, he was convinced that democracy was inevitable and couldn't really be easily escaped. And the crucial point here is that Schumpeter shifts the focus in his thinking of democracy away from the emphatic sovereignty emphasizing notion of democracy as the expression of the general will in a comprehensive popular sense, to what in fact nowadays is the dominant view of democracy, which is, well, let's park all of that. And yes, that's probably true at some level, but what really is democracy is elections. And what Schumpeter pioneers in political science, he's not alone in doing this, and he's not the only one thinking skeptical thoughts about the standard story in this period. Walter Lippmann, for instance, comes to mind in the United States in this period as well. What Schumpeter says is, no, if we're realistic about class society, what we best think of democracy as being is a particular mechanism used to select which elites will dominate at any given period the political system. And the logic of modern politics is that to do this simply as an elite contest would be unstable and unsustainable. So instead, we have this system in which democratic electoral contests decide the distribution of political power between elites. And this is this dominant move. Now, you can read that as hyper cynical, and a kind of particular brand of American political science has taken it in that direction. But reading up on Schumpeter for this show, what I was struck by was some interesting new work on Schumpeter's relationship with Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt is the legal theorist of National Socialism, one of the most brilliant minds in Germany in the 20s and 30s and 40s. In fact, continued writing after World War II in internal exile or exclusion. A little bit a figure like Schumpeter in some senses, something like a fish slightly out of water but struggling to get a grip on the contemporary world. And they were colleagues in Bonn in the 1920s, and there is well-attested correspondence between the two of them. And why this matters to this question is that Schmitt in the 1920s was using a classic conception of democracy as popular sovereignty, as the assertion of the people's will against liberalism, and was basically arguing in the name of what then would become a kind of national, folkish, racially unified notion, a democratic legitimation of National Socialism. And counterposing that to what Schmitt denounced as the epiphenomenon of parliamentary life, the absurdity of debate amongst elites in the parliament, and insisting, if you like, that the true Democrats in this politics were those who were mobilizing in the street and mobilizing the National Socialist German Workers' Coalition, which was this radical new coalition of forces which had never been organized politically. This is certainly Schmitt's position by the 30s. And if you view Schumpeter as being in dialogue with Schmitt over the corpse, if you like, of classic 19th century conceptions of democracy, then the interesting thing is that Schumpeter's position can be seen more as a kind of skillful tactical retreat to saying, yes, I know that parliamentary mechanisms and electoralism are not the same thing as the emphatic assertion of popular will. But since that's unrealistic, I don't think you're in good faith in making that argument. And we should instead embrace this more formalist procedural understanding of what democracy does as its core. And if not celebrate it, then realistically appreciate its merits, certainly by comparison with other available mechanisms. He was always, throughout his life, really fundamentally a defender of aristocracy, which he had thought in some ways he embodied, right? The best rider, the best lover, the best economists of Vienna. This is an aristocratic set of claims. And his real ideal was ultimately British Toryism, right? Which the British Conservative Party, which managed its retreat from truly aristocratic elitist politics to success in the democratic system, in Schumpeter's terms, by understanding the democracy didn't have to be the rule of the people, let alone the mob. It could be a mechanism successfully exploited by elites to secure their rule in more modern, legitimate ways. And for him, they were really the great exponents of skillful modern politics for the democratic age.
Interesting. Yeah, I've often wondered what a liberal version of Carl Schmitt would be, and perhaps Schumpeter's political thinking could be one version of that. But
somewhere between Schumpeter and Keynes, in my view.
I guess to end this conversation, I'm curious, you mentioned the Tories as one of his Schumpeter's own political ideals, but in reading about his political biography, I was surprised to see him express sympathies. I suppose this is in his private correspondence, but he expressed sympathies towards Imperial Japan during the period of the Second World War. He was also a great skeptic of FDR in the United States. Of course, he was not alone in that in terms of being a conservative, but also in his foreign policy views, even after the war, I think was concerned about the positioning of Germany and wanted to make sure, I suppose, that Germany was not punished too harshly. I'm just curious, overall, how could we evaluate his foreign policy views? I mean, is there some internal connection between his economic thinking and those views? I mean, or is this kind of more of a sort of contingent set of political views that he had when it came to thinking about the rest of the world?
Yeah, it's interesting that we find a figure like Schumpeter so difficult to place nowadays. But I think at the time, again, I think the British analogy is useful, is that he's simply a European, a deeply conservative European. That's the long and the short of this story. And so for both him and his wife, Elizabeth Schumpeter, who in her own right was a notable expert on Japanese political economy. She's the first woman to get a summa cum laude degree in economics from Radcliffe. She did graduate work at Harvard and Radcliffe in the 1920s. She was one of America's leading experts on Japanese political economy. And the two of them together, I think, can be seen as adopting essentially an appeasement position, which is that, we don't judge, if you like, we don't externally impose our value system on societies as different as Germany and Japan. We hope that they will converge with us. Elizabeth Schumpeter writes quite powerfully about the contending factions in Imperial Japan and the fact that there's a liberal faction and a group within the army which are not interested in expanding the war, all of which is true. And there is a sense that the real question is, what strategies towards these antagonists will make the situation better or worse. And the basic analysis is, not what is normatively good, but what is realistically the best set of moves to make under these circumstances. And the common position seems to be that a strategy of confrontation means war. And from war, only two forces can benefit, one of which is the domestic creeping socialization of Western societies. And that's really where the opposition to Roosevelt and the New Deal comes in. There's this famous Schumpeter off-the-record quote of 10 years of war against Germany and Japan and 10 years more of Roosevelt's dictatorship. And on the other hand, the only power that can really benefit is the Soviet Union. And if you're thinking geopolitically and in the broadest sense of the word, then from the position of someone interested in maintaining shreds of the early 20th century world that are, evaporating around you, then a large apocalyptic global war fought in alliance with the Soviet Union for the formation of the United Nations is a nightmare in a way, right? It's driving that process of unification and bureaucratization to the final extent. And you, as a realist, know perhaps that there is no alternative to that. But given the choice, is this where you would like to see the world going? No, it's not. And to that extent, I think you can see parallels with, people like Schmidt. But dare one say it, even somebody certainly the appeasement-orientated conservatives in Britain in the 1930s, for whom, the central reason for not confronting Hitler and for trying to find a modus vivendi was precisely so as not to let Stalin in. Right? That's the central preoccupation. And Churchill would be another interesting counterpart here, because he always saw that communist threat and was the arch Tory Democrat, right? In some senses, the smartest exponent of this kind of politics, and yet in the end, of course, recognizes the need for confrontation and whatever alliances are necessary. But I think this is the milieu that somebody like Schumpeter belongs in, setting aside some of the uglier things that he's on the record of having said in the late 30s. I think we can rule out a kind of crass anti-Semitism as a driver of his politics. He was actually, and this worth saying given the question, actively involved in the rescue of persecuted academics from Europe. But at this deeper level of the kind of logic of history, at odds with, the wartime configuration.
Interesting, yeah. And not that even tensions in a body of thought need to all be resolved, but it's interesting in one hand that he seems so trusting of kind of bourgeois managerial elites in one sense, but the figure of the entrepreneur that we were discussing before itself is a kind of almost disruptive, revolutionary figure almost to a given order that he seems to also value. But I suppose that's precisely why it's such a kind of rich body of thought to be considering. As I said, this series on Heterodox Economists will be ongoing. We'll talk about the next one in a few weeks' time. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by Adam and me and produced by Claudia Tatey. The show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers and Ones and Tooze listeners, including Lawrence Price, Francis Jones, Goran B., Elias Bamidis, Alex Mackel, Tim, Fabian, Robert, Brendan Winter, and Yannick. I do hope I pronounced those names right. Apologies if I didn't. As always, we do love getting listener feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's at Ones and Tooze Pod. I'm Cameron Abadi. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.